fighting for something so evil and so unjust that they were willing to die for it simply for financial gain.
For generations, the story of the Alamo has been told as a tale of freedom. Texas heroes Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, William B. Travis, making their last stand against impossible odds, a band of pioneers sacrificing themselves for liberty. That's a myth. But beneath the gunsmoke and cannon fire, there's another story, a darker story. One that rarely makes it into movies, the textbooks, or patriotic slogans. The Battle of the Alamo was not only a fight for independence, it was a fight to protect slavery. To understand this, we have to peel back the layers of the legend. The Alamo was not just about freedom from Mexico, it was about freedom for whom? Anglo-American settlers demanded liberty to build plantations, liberty to profit from enslaved labor, liberty to preserve a racial hierarchy that Mexico had outlawed. So while defending the Alamo, they died shouting liberty or death. The liberty they envisioned was a liberty to own other human beings. And that's how the story begins. We'll journey through the Texas Revolution, not as Hollywood imagined it, but as it really was, a clash over slavery, race, and power. We'll uncover how Mexico's abolition of slavery enraged the Anglo settlers, how the Texas Declaration of Independence explicitly condemned Mexico for banning slavery, and how the heroes inside the Alamo brought their enslaved peoples with them into the fortress. And in the end, we'll ask, whose freedom was really defended at the Alamo? This is the Alamo and the slavery, the battle beneath the battle. In 1829, Mexico made the decision that would ripple across the continent. President Vincent Guerrero himself, of mixed African descent, issued a decree. Slavery was abolished in Mexico. For the enslaved, this was a beacon of hope. Mexico became a land where freedom was law. In the southern United States, whispers spread. If you could cross into Mexico territory, you could be free. And many did. Hundreds of enslaved men and women fled across the border, seeking liberation. But while enslaved people saw Mexico as a refuge, Anglo-American settlers saw it as a threat. When Americans first moved into Texas, then part of Mexico, they brought their enslaved workers with them. They cleared fields, planted cotton, and built their fortune on the back of enslaved Africans. But now, Mexico's abolition law cut directly against their way of life. To settlers, Mexico's promise of freedom to enslaved people wasn't a triumph. It was a nightmare, because without slavery, their plantations, their wealth, their ambitions would collapse. And so, from the beginning, there was a clash at the heart of Texas. Mexico envisioned Texas as free soil. Anglo colonists envisioned Texas as an extension of the slaveholding South. This wasn't just a cultural clash, it was an economic one, an ideological one. And it was about to get violent, because while Mexico stood firm on its principles, settlers were determined to bend, twist, and outright break the law to preserve slavery. This conflict between the abolitionist Mexico and the slaveholding settlers wasn't just a backdrop to the Texas Revolution. It was the Texas Revolution. The Alamo, the battle, the bloodshed to come, they were all rooted in this moment, in this law, in this clash over slavery. They call him the father of Texas, Stephen F. Austin. Austin led the first major wave of Anglo-American colonists into Mexican Texas. To many, he was a pioneer, a builder of communities, a visionary who opened a new frontier. But there's a part of his vision often left out of the legend. Austin wasn't just bringing families, wagons, and the hope of prosperity, he was bringing slavery. In the early 1820s, Mexico granted Austin permission to settle hundreds of families in Texas. Most of them came from the American South, and most of them brought enslaved people with them. Cotton was king, and enslaved labor was its throne. There was just one problem. Mexico had abolished slavery. But Austin had no intentions of building a society without it. To get around the law, he helped invent a loophole. Settlers didn't own enslaved people anymore, at least not on paper. Instead, they signed contracts that claimed enslaved men and women were indentured servants, bound to work for decades, often for 99 years. It was slavery by another name, a thin disguise, and Austin fought hard to make sure Mexican officials turned a blind eye. He wrote letters, lobbied governors, and argued that without enslaved labor, Anglo colonists would abandon Texas. This wasn't just economics, it was ideology. Settlers like Austin believed slavery was necessary, even natural. When Mexican authorities pushed back, Austin and the other colonists pushed harder. They insisted that slavery was essential for Texas to thrive. Without it, they argued, Texas would remain wilderness. With it, Texas could become another American South. And so, the stage was set. Anglo colonists weren't just defying Mexican law, they were shaping Texas into a slave-holding society. This fight over slavery wasn't quiet. It wasn't hidden. It was open, raw, and unrelenting. For Austin and his colonists, the question wasn't if Texas would have slavery. The question was how long Mexico could be forced to tolerate it. The settlers had planted cotton, they had planted slavery, and they had planted the seeds of rebellion. Because when Mexico finally decided to enforce its anti-slavery laws, Anglo settlers would not back down. They would fight. By the early 1830s, tensions in Texas had reached a breaking point. Mexico had abolished slavery, but the Anglo settlers, led by men like Stephen F. Austin, refused to let it go. They built plantations, signed fraudulent contracts, and fought to preserve human bondage under another name. And then came a man who would not look the other way, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. To Anglo settlers, he would become a villain of Texas history, the dictator, the tyrant, the man who sent troops to crush their freedom. But from Mexico's perspective, Santa Anna was enforcing the law and defending a nation that had chosen liberty over slavery. When Santa Anna rose to power, he centralized authority, cracked down on dissent, and demanded loyalty from Texas. But among the many causes of unrest, one stood out: slavery. Anglo settlers wanted the right to enslave people. Mexico had banned it, and Santa Anna made it clear he would not compromise. To the settlers, this wasn't tyranny, this was terror, because it threatened the very foundation of their wealth, their power, and their way of life. The conflict was no longer just about governance. It was about race, about labor, about whether Texas would be a free territory or a slaveholding one. Santa Anna sent troops north to enforce Mexico's law. For Anglo settlers, this was the nightmare come true. Mexican soldiers marching into their town, reminding them that slavery was outlawed. And so, whispers of rebellion turned into open calls for war. To Anglo colonists, Santa Anna was not just an authoritarian ruler, he was the man who would take their enslaved labor away, the man who would unravel their economic system, the man who threatened white supremacy in Texas. Santa Anna's crackdown didn't silence the settlers, it ignited them. When the shots finally rang out, the cry wasn't just for liberty from Mexico, it was for liberty to keep slavery alive. The war for Texas had begun. March 2nd, 1836, Washington on the Brazos. Just 4 days before the Alamo fell, Texian rebels gathered to sign a document that would change history, the Texas Declaration of Independence. On the surface, it looked like a cousin to the America's 1776 Declaration, lofty words about liberty, tyranny, and self-determination. But buried in the text was something different, something that revealed the true heart of the revolution. Quoting from it, it has enacted an intolerable grievance by abolishing the system of slavery. There it was, in black and white. Unlike Jefferson's declaration, the Texans' document openly condemned Mexico for ending slavery. The Texan rebels weren't just fighting for independence, they were fighting to make slavery legal again. To Anglo settlers, Mexico's abolition of slavery wasn't a moral triumph. It was, as the Declaration called it, an intolerable grievance, an outrage. This wasn't rhetoric tucked away in a private letter. It was enshrined in the founding document of Texas. The Texas Republic was being born, not as a free society, but as a slave republic. The men at the Washington on Brazos weren't shy about it. They built slavery into their revolution. They framed it as a right worth dying for. Within days, some of them would prove it. At a mission fortress in San Antonio called the Alamo. When we talk about the defenders of the Alamo, we often speak of freedom. But whose freedom was it? Not the freedom of the enslaved men and women brought into that compound. Not the freedom of the black Texans who were never invited to the table of independence. The freedom the rebels proclaimed was the freedom to own other human beings. The ink was barely dry on the Declaration when the cannon fire at the Alamo roared. February 1836, San Antonio de Bexar. Inside an old Spanish mission turned fortress, the Alamo, fewer than 200 Texian defenders prepared for a siege. Outside, nearly 2,000 Mexican troops under General Santa Anna surrounded them. For 30 days, cannon fire shook the walls, muskets cracked. The men inside clung to their vision of freedom. But what kind of freedom? The Alamo had been remembered as a shrine to liberty, but for many of its defenders, liberty meant the right to own other human beings. Enslaved people were inside the Alamo during the siege. They were there not as soldiers, but as property. Jim Bowie, one of the commanders, had enslaved workers with him. William B. Travis, another leader, was a slaveholder. Even David Crockett, immortalized as a frontiersman, came from a world swept in slavery. The men who fought at the Alamo did not bring their enslaved workers to join their cause. They brought them to cook, to clean, to serve. When the fortress finally fell, the story of those enslaved people took a different turn. March the 6th. Before dawn, Santa Anna ordered his troops to storm the mission. Within 90 minutes, every defender was dead. Travis, Bowie, Crockett, all killed. But the enslaved survived. Santa Anna spared them. He recognized them not as enemies, but as captives, people forced to serve men who claimed to be fighting for liberty. Think about that. The Mexican army slaughtered the so-called heroes of the Alamo, but spared the enslaved people. Because Mexico did not see them as rebels, Mexico saw them as free. For generations, the Alamo has been remembered as the last stand for freedom. But if we look closer, the story bends. The freedom defended inside those walls was not freedom for all. It was freedom for white settlers to preserve slavery. The enslaved men and women who walked out alive that morning were living proof that the Alamo was not a simple struggle for liberty versus tyranny, but a battle fought to uphold bondage. So when they say they died for freedom, we gotta ask, whose freedom? On April 21st, 1836, on a grassy plain near the San Jacinto River, the fate of Texas was decided in just 18 minutes. Texas forces under General Sam Houston launched a surprise attack against Santa Anna's army. The battle was quick, brutal, and decisive. Hundreds of Mexican soldiers were killed. Santa Anna himself was captured. The Texans had won. And from that victory, a new nation was born, the Republic of Texas. But behind the flags and speeches, the new republic carried a darker birthright, because the first Constitution of Texas did not just protect liberty, it enshrined slavery. The Texas Constitution of 1836 guaranteed that slavery would remain legal. It went further than that. It banned free black people from living in Texas altogether. No emancipation was allowed without the consent of Congress. Enslaved people were property, and their status was untouchable. Texas was not only separate from Mexico, it was separate from the idea of freedom itself. For Anglo settlers, San Jacinto was a triumph. The moment their vision of a slave republic became reality, cotton fields would spread, plantations would grow. The wealth of Texas would rest on the back of enslaved Africans and African Americans. For Black Texans, however, San Jacinto marked the closing of the door to freedom. Under Mexican law, they could have been free. Under the Texas Republic, their bondage was sealed by law. The Alamo had fallen, and its defenders' cause lived on, not in the universal promise of liberty, but in the promise of slavery. And yet, as the myth of Texas independence grew, the truth faded. The story of San Jacinto became a tale of heroism, not of human bondage. For nearly 2 centuries, the Alamo has been remembered as a shrine to freedom. Remember the Alamo, brave men who gave their lives for liberty. But that's not the whole story. The Alamo has been wrapped in myth, polished into a patriotic legend where white frontiersmen fought against tyranny. What was erased from memory was the fact that they also fought to preserve slavery. After Texas won its independence, the Republic enshrined slavery into law. But when Texas told their story, slavery disappeared. Instead, they spoke of liberty, bravery, and sacrifice. By the late 19th century, Texas had joined the United States, and Jim Crow segregation hardened. The Alamo became a symbol of white Southern heritage. Its defenders were cast as martyrs for freedom, while the enslaved people who stood inside those walls with them were erased from the narrative. Remember the Alamo. School books retold the story as one of good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny. Hollywood films brought it to the silver screen. John Wayne's The Alamo turned the battle into pure myth, with no mention of slavery at all. In reality, the Alamo was not a universal fight for freedom. It was a fight for the freedom of one group, white settlers, to enslave another. By erasing slavery from the narrative, Texas created a usable past, a heroic origin stories that celebrated white sacrifice while ignoring black suffering. And yet, history can't be silenced forever. Today, historians are revisiting the story. They are asking the harder questions. They are reminding us that enslaved people were present at the Alamo, that Mexico had outlawed slavery, that the Texas Revolution, in many ways, a war to keep slavery. Remember the Alamo, they told us. But what we remember depends on what story we chose to tell.
But yes, I have a history degree. If you can see it on my wall, it's from Indiana University. I graduated in 2024. My concentration was U.S. history because I was, I'm black. So, I loved social studies growing up in high school and elementary school. So I decided to stick with it instead of political science. And plus it like resonates with my history because my great grandmother and great grandfather, they were sharecroppers in Tennessee and Mississippi. So it wasn't that long ago for me. So I just stuck with history.
Then this is you're the perfect person for this subject.
Thank
So
you.
we talked about the Alamo in the
Yes.
story and how much history had been whitewashed by saying it was for freedom, even though it
Yes.
was really for the freedom
Slavery.
to own slaves.
Mhm.
What were your thoughts on that?
So, I'm gonna be honest. So, I didn't know much about the Alamo. Obviously, I've heard about it, but that's one thing we didn't go into depth with in my professional studies. So, a lot of the stuff we went over was World War II and like the war wars, as well as military history. And then of course some history about like artifacts and stuff like that. So when I was learning about the Alamo last night and this morning, I just learned more about it and the fact that we all know that Mexico was fighting for independence as well as the right to not own slaves. And then you get the alternate history, which is where they get the quote of "Remember the Alamo" when they're saying it was a fight for freedom. And then you come to find out it was the right for states or slave owners to continue slavery well into former Mexico territory, which is now Texas.
Yeah. And I think it was interesting in there because Mexico had abolished slavery before the US.
Yes, a lot of countries did, honestly.
Yeah. And a lot of people try and gloss over that fact. But the Alamo happened because Mexico was trying to enforce their law
Yes.
of no slavery,
Mhm.
even though the Texans at the time were trying to keep slaves because that's how they were going to grow their economy in their mind.
Yes.
And I just think that a lot of people just don't realize that.
Yes, because honestly, when I go through TikTok or whatever, and it's the black versus brown, and black people not participating in protests. So a lot of the comments would be, "Oh, Mexicans fought for the independence of slavery," which I do understand because in the 1830s they did abolish slavery in formerly Texas, but now Mexico territory. But then you have to think about the effects that slavery had on Mexico even after their abolishment of slavery. Like the president, which is Santa Anna, who emancipated slaves or whatever, he was part, black, part Hispanic or part Mexican. But when you look at today's society and the way that Hispanic people, or let's be specific, Mexican people treat their darker skinned citizens, is still like affected by slavery and the Reconstruction era. So when they were saying stuff like that, like Mexico fought for the independence, which I totally agree, there are multiple factors in the abolishment of slavery. It wasn't just black people or white people. There are also Mexicans and Native Americans, as well as the British that we gained our independence from. So I think it's very important for people to learn more about history because even in college I didn't really learn about the Alamo. So it's more important to learn about it now, even past graduate school or past undergrad, because you have to understand that history broken down is his story. So the person who's involved with it is going to tell it and make them seem like they're the righteous ones and they were fighting for the right purposes when it truly was not.
Yeah. And there was accounts of the Alamo from the slaves that were taken in there, um, because everybody else was killed besides the slaves, because Santa Anna believed that they were captured prisoners instead of slaves. So he
Yes.
didn't, none of them were killed. So there was that account, but that account was suppressed after the American Civil War.
Yeah.
So
I
we,
saw something about that earlier where the Mexicans or the people who were fighting for the side of the Alamo, they were like, we're taking no prisoners. Like this, we're not going to take any prisoners. Like it's going to be kill or be killed, which I understand because it was Anglo Americans trying to suppress their power and position of authority in their region. Like you can't come into America and say, "Hey, I'm going to overthrow Donald Trump." So I don't understand why they went into Mexican territories like, "Hey, I'm going to overthrow Santa Anna," just because of financial gain. That's where the ethical dilemmas start to relapse because it's like I'm gaining personal or financial gain, but I'm also causing harm and trauma onto people who don't necessarily look exactly like me.
yeah, for sure. And it's kind of crazy that Texas kept up this idea that it was for independence, even
Yes.
though they lost what they were hoping for in the Civil War, which was to keep slaves.
Yes.
But they had to fight the Mexican government because they had to get rid of slaves there. And
Hmm.
then they had to go fight the US government because the US government was going to get rid of their slaves too. So they
Yeah.
really fought two wars
Hmm.
basically to keep slaves.
Yes. And lost a lot of casualties along the way. As well as I'm not even going to say history, but in a way, history, because think if those people didn't fight in the war and they would, prolong their familial trees or whatever. So they could have taught, like, hey, I was in this battle or I was in this war, and this is why I feel like now, when I look back at it, that this was wrong. They didn't even have the grace to get that because they were fighting for something so evil and so unjust that they were willing to die for it simply for financial gain. And that's why I find it, I'm not gonna say funny, but kind of funny that Texas is still like it's a state with a booming economy in certain aspects, but at the same time, their literacy is low, their education is low. Southern states who wanted to uphold slavery, they're the worst off states imaginable. And I live in Indiana, so I'm a part of the Union at the time, but also Indiana is referred to as the southernmost northern state because Indiana had a lot of, slavery epithets or slave history, like the Ku Klux Klan or like the female version of the Ku Klux Klan was born and bred here. And it's just like these people fought to basically be ignorant. They fought to be ignorant and be selfishly wealthy, and it still didn't go their way. So I don't see how maybe the state of Texas hasn't issued an apology for the casualties that they caused for simply slavery, for upholding injustices for people, when the Constitution that was around at that time said all people are created equally. But, not all people, we were three-fifths of a person. And then I don't know what the fraction of Hispanic Americans and Native Americans were, probably greater than Black Americans. But it's just crazy that they fought a battle twice and lost and still have no problem with claiming that they were victorious in that battle.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Well, that's about 10 minutes. Thank you for coming on.
No
I
problem.
appreciate it. I'm going to try and get this up by Saturday.
Okay.
As soon as I get it.
Okay. Thank you for having me. If you want to have any other discussions about like the military or military history, I can do that too because I'm a veteran. But I am grateful for this opportunity. I was so happy to be on this podcast. I told everyone I know about it. But justice for those who died protecting the injustices that slavery was in Mexico or Texas. Condolences to all those lost, and congratulations to the Mexican citizens who were fighting for the right side of justice.
I will definitely probably have you on again.
Thank you. I'll be better next time. Again, the Alamo is a new concept to me because I did not learn much about it. U.S. history was U.S. history, even though we took parts of certain lands from other cultures. But yeah, this was a great time. I had fun learning about the Alamo. Now my TikTok feed is like full of the Alamo, and like I have so many web browsers opened up about the Alamo. But if you would have me again, I'd be very grateful for it, and I'll probably be more well versed in other subjects. I'll give you that.
For sure. I'll have you on again.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
though.